At 2:14 p. in Mashhad, Doha time this afternoon, the government of Qatar made an announcement that reverberates through every calculation Tehran has made about surviving the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Qatar, the one Gulf state that maintained diplomatic relations with Iran through decades of regional tensions, the nation that shares the world's largest natural gas field with Iran, the country that consistently advocated for dialogue rather than confrontation with Tehran, just went completely silent on the blockade. What happened in those Doha conference rooms over the last 72 hours reveals that Iran has lost its final ally in the Gulf, and the implications are catastrophic for any hope of Iranian diplomatic escape from the economic disaster the blockade created. Qatar's relationship with Iran has always been complicated, pragmatic, and driven by geography and resources that neither country can change. The two nations share the North Dome and South Pars gas field, a massive hydrocarbon reservoir containing approximately 51 trillion cubic meters of natural gas that sits beneath the Persian Gulf, with Qatari territory on one side and Iranian territory on the other. That shared resource created economic interdependence that survived regional crises that destroyed relationships between Iran and other Gulf states. When Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt imposed a diplomatic and economic blockade against Qatar in 2017, Iran provided air corridor access, food supplies, and political support that helped Qatar survive the isolation campaign. That assistance created a debt that Qatar has repaid through quiet diplomacy, discreet trade relationships, and careful avoidance of overtly anti-Iranian positions that other Gulf states adopted enthusiastically. For 6 years, Qatar served as the bridge between Iran and the Arab Gulf states, the nation willing to talk to Tehran when others refused. That bridge just burned. Qatar's foreign ministry released a statement 90 minutes ago that avoided mentioning Iran by name, but could not have been clearer in substance. The statement affirmed Qatar's absolute commitment to freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. It expressed support for international efforts to ensure commercial shipping can transit the waterway without interference. It called on all parties to respect international maritime law and refrain from actions that threaten regional stability. And it announced that Qatar was suspending all diplomatic initiatives related to the Strait of Hormuz crisis, pending restoration of normal shipping operations. That last line is the critical one. Qatar is not mediating. Qatar is not advocating for dialogue. Qatar is not proposing compromises or face-saving measures for Iran. Qatar is stepping back completely and waiting for the crisis to resolve itself through Iranian capitulation or Iranian collapse. That represents abandonment of Iran by the one nation Tehran believed would continue supporting them regardless of how badly the blockade strategy failed. The silence is even more significant than the statement. Qatar's government has stopped answering Iranian phone calls. Qatari diplomats have stopped attending meetings with Iranian counterparts. Qatari state media has stopped covering the crisis from perspectives sympathetic to Iranian positions. The entire Qatari diplomatic and media apparatus has simply stopped engaging with Iran, as if Tehran no longer exists as a relevant actor in regional affairs. That silence communicates more clearly than any public statement could. Qatar has concluded that Iran is going to lose, that association with Iran's losing position carries costs Qatar is unwilling to pay, and that Qatari interests are better served by alignment with the nations that are going to win. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because Qatar's decision to abandon Iran marks a decisive turning point in this crisis, and what Tehran does in response over the next 48 hours will determine whether the regime survives the month. The timing reveals careful Qatari calculation. Qatar did not abandon Iran during the first week of the crisis, when outcomes were uncertain and Iranian threats carried credibility. Qatar did not abandon Iran during the second week when the economic pain began, but diplomatic escape routes still appeared possible. Qatar abandoned Iran this week, after 3 weeks of blockade failure demonstrated that Iran cannot enforce closure, cannot force concessions, and cannot find diplomatic solutions that preserve regime credibility. Qatar waited until the outcome was clear before switching positions, minimizing risk while positioning themselves for the post-crisis regional order. That careful timing exposes the fundamental weakness of Iran's regional position. Iran has no allies. Iran has clients that accept Iranian money and weapons, but feel no loyalty to Iranian interests. Iran has tactical partnerships based on shared enemies rather than shared values or genuine alignment. And Iran has one nation, Qatar, that maintains civil relations based on geographical proximity and shared resource development. None of those relationships translated into support when Iran needed it most. Hezbollah, Iran's primary proxy force, has been conspicuously quiet throughout the crisis. No statements of support for the blockade. No threats against Israeli or American interests. No mobilization of forces or inflammatory rhetoric. Hezbollah understands that Iran's strategy failed and that association with that failure damages Hezbollah's position in Lebanon, where they face increasing domestic opposition to their role as Iranian proxy. Hezbollah's silence represents calculated distance from a losing proposition. The Houthi movement in Yemen, another Iranian proxy, briefly attempted to demonstrate support through attacks on shipping in the Red Sea during the crisis's first week. Those attacks accomplished nothing except attracting immediate retaliation from Saudi and American forces that destroyed Houthi missile capabilities and killed dozens of Houthi fighters. The attacks stopped. The Houthis learned the same lesson that Iran is learning. Military action that cannot succeed generates costs without benefits. The Houthis have gone silent just like Qatar, just like Hezbollah, just like everyone else who maintained connections to Iran when doing so appeared cost-free. Iraqi Shia militia groups that receive Iranian funding and direction have similarly failed to demonstrate meaningful support. A few symbolic statements expressing solidarity with Iranian sovereignty, but no actual military or economic actions that would aid Iranian strategy or impose costs on Iranian adversaries. The Iraqi government itself, heavily influenced by Iran for 2 decades, has maintained strict neutrality throughout the crisis, refusing to take any action that would be interpreted as supporting the blockade. The pattern is clear and devastating for Tehran. Iran's clients and partners support Iranian interests only when that support is cost-free and convenient. The moment supporting Iran carries real costs or risks, the support evaporates. Iran has built a regional network based entirely on transactional relationships that contain no genuine loyalty, no ideological commitment, and no willingness to sacrifice for Iranian interests. That network is now revealed as completely hollow when tested under actual crisis conditions. Qatar's abandonment is particularly significant because it demonstrates that even nations with strong economic incentives to maintain positive relations with Iran will sacrifice those relationships when forced to choose sides in confrontation with the United States and the broader international community. The North Dome and South Pars gas field generates billions of dollars annually for both Qatar and Iran. Cooperation on development of that shared resource has been profitable for both nations and should create powerful incentives for Qatar to protect its relationship with Iran. Those economic incentives proved less powerful than the geopolitical calculation that association with Iran's failed blockade strategy would damage Qatari relationships with the United States, European nations, and Arab Gulf states that collectively represent far more significant economic and security partnerships than anything Iran can provide. Qatar chose the winning side, sacrificing its relationship with Iran to preserve and strengthen relationships with nations that control Qatar's security guarantees, defense systems, liquefied natural gas export markets, and investment capital. The economic calculation was straightforward. Qatar exports approximately 107 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas annually, generating roughly $70 billion in revenue. The primary markets are in Asia and Europe, with Japan, South Korea, China, and India as major purchasers. Every single one of those markets depends on secure energy transportation through shipping lanes that the United States Navy protects. Qatar's natural gas business model is entirely dependent on the global maritime security architecture that the United States maintains. Iran's blockade threatened that security architecture. If Iran's strategy had succeeded in closing the Strait of Hormuz or making commercial shipping so dangerous that insurance costs became prohibitive, Qatar's entire liquefied natural gas export business would face existential threat. Qatari LNG tankers transit the Strait of Hormuz on every voyage to Asian markets. Iranian missiles or fast attack boats threatening those tankers would destroy Qatar's economic model, regardless of the historical relationship or shared gas field. Qatar's leadership calculated that their economic survival depends on the maritime security system that the United States guarantees, not on good relations with Iran. When forced to choose, they chose security and access to global markets over historical partnerships and shared resources. That choice reveals the fundamental asymmetry in Iran's regional relationships. Iran needs its partners more than its partners need Iran. When relationships are tested, Iran loses every time. The diplomatic isolation this creates is comprehensive and accelerating. Saudi Arabia already viewed Iran as an enemy and welcomed the blockade's failure. The United Arab Emirates similarly celebrated Iranian setbacks. Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman all maintained careful neutrality that clearly favored the anti-Iranian position. Now, Qatar has joined that consensus, eliminating the final Gulf state voice that advocated for Iranian interests or mediated between Iran and its adversaries. Iran now faces a united Gulf Cooperation Council, aligned against Iranian regional ambitions for the first time in decades. The sectarian and political divisions that Iran exploited to prevent unified Arab Gulf opposition to Iranian expansion have been temporarily overcome by shared recognition that the Iranian blockade threatened everyone's economic interests. Qatar's decision to abandon Iran rather than maintain its traditional mediator role eliminates the internal Gulf divisions that Iran relied upon to prevent coordinated action against Iranian interests. This united front creates opportunities for the Gulf states to pressure Iran economically, politically, and militarily in ways that would have been impossible when Qatar advocated for dialogue and moderation. Economic sanctions can be tightened without Qatari resistance. Military cooperation can deepen without Qatari concerns about escalation. Diplomatic initiatives can proceed without Qatari efforts to preserve Iranian face-saving options. The regional balance has shifted decisively against Iran, and Qatar's silence on the Hormuz blockade marks the moment that shift became permanent. The international implications extend beyond the Gulf. Turkey, which maintained complex relationships with Iran, balancing economic interests against NATO membership, has quietly signaled through diplomatic channels that it supports free navigation through the Strait of Hormuz and expects Iran to end interference with commercial shipping. That Turkish position aligns Ankara with Washington, Brussels, and Gulf capitals against Tehran, representing another significant relationship loss for Iran. China, which many analysts expected would provide Iran with diplomatic and economic cover during the crisis, has instead delivered private warnings to Tehran that the blockade threatens Chinese energy security and that continued disruption will force China to reconsider its strategic partnership with Iran. China's abandonment is particularly significant because Iran viewed Chinese support as guaranteed based on shared opposition to U.S. influence in the region. That assumption proved wrong. China prioritizes its own interests above any partnership with Iran, and when those interests conflict, Iran loses Chinese support immediately. Russia, which has coordinated with Iran in Syria and occasionally aligned on anti-American positions, has similarly failed to provide meaningful support. Russian officials made generic statements about respecting Iranian sovereignty, but took no actions that would aid Iranian strategy or impose costs on nations opposing the blockade. Russia's calculation is entirely cynical. A weakened Iran serves Russian interests by reducing global oil supplies, elevating prices, and increasing Russian energy revenues. Russia has no incentive to help Iran succeed, and every incentive to watch Iran fail while maintaining plausible deniability about Russian indifference to Iranian interests. Make sure you stay subscribed and notifications stay on, because the complete diplomatic isolation of Iran creates a situation where Tehran has no cards left to play and no partners willing to help them escape the crisis they created. And what happens next will be determined entirely by internal Iranian political dynamics that are growing increasingly unstable. The isolation extends beyond governments to international institutions and multinational corporations. The International Maritime Organization, the International Energy Agency, and insurance underwriters that provide coverage for commercial shipping have all issued statements condemning interference with freedom of navigation and calling for immediate restoration of normal transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Those statements carry significant economic weight because they establish the legal and regulatory framework that governs global shipping and energy trade. Major oil companies, including ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and Total Energies, suspended all business operations related to Iranian oil within days of the blockade announcement. Those suspensions remain in place and will continue indefinitely until Iran demonstrates it no longer threatens commercial shipping. The companies face no pressure from their home governments to resume Iranian operations, and substantial pressure from investors, customers, and regulators to avoid any association with a nation that threatened global energy security. International shipping companies that operate the tankers carrying crude oil and refined products through global markets have similarly blacklisted Iran. Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, CMA CGM Group, and other major carriers will not transport Iranian goods, will not call at Iranian ports, and will not provide services that benefit Iranian trade. That blacklisting is voluntary, driven by corporate risk calculations rather than legal requirements, which makes it more difficult for Iran to overcome through diplomatic negotiations or sanctions relief. The insurance industry, which provides the coverage that enables modern shipping to function, has classified Iranian waters and approaches to Iranian territory as high-risk zones that require premium coverage at rates that make commercial operations economically unviable. Even if shipping companies wanted to transport Iranian goods, insurance costs would make those operations unprofitable. The insurance classification persists regardless of whether the formal blockade continues, because underwriters base risk assessments on demonstrated Iranian willingness to threaten shipping rather than on current Iranian policy statements. This comprehensive economic isolation means that even if Iran formally ends the blockade tomorrow, the economic consequences will persist for months or years until international businesses regain confidence that Iran will not repeat this behavior. The damage to Iranian trade relationships, business partnerships, and commercial reputation cannot be reversed through diplomatic statements. It requires sustained demonstration of changed behavior over extended periods. Iran's oil exports, which reached zero during the blockade, will not immediately return to pre-crisis levels even after the blockade ends. The international buyers, shippers, and insurers that abandoned Iran during the crisis will not rush back. Qatar's abandonment of Iran, following similar decisions by every other nation and institution with relationships to Iran, creates a situation where Tehran faces the full economic, political, and military costs of the blockade strategy without any offsetting benefits from alliance relationships or diplomatic support. Iran is alone, completely, facing consequences that are accelerating rather than stabilizing, with no international support structure to cushion the impact or provide alternative paths forward. Iranian officials are desperately seeking any relationship they can leverage to escape isolation. Outreach to China, Russia, Turkey, Qatar, Oman, Pakistan, and India over the last 72 hours has produced nothing except polite deflections and suggestions that Iran should end the blockade and negotiate with the United States. No nation is willing to antagonize Washington, damage relationships with Gulf states, or accept economic costs to help Iran escape a crisis of Iran's own creation. The silence from Qatar, which comes after similar silence from every other potential Iranian partner, marks the end of any illusion that Iran's regional relationships provide strategic depth or crisis resilience. Those relationships were always transactional and shallow. They provided benefits during stable periods but offered no support during actual crisis. Now that the crisis has revealed their hollowness, Iran cannot rebuild them through the same transactional approach. Nations and institutions that abandoned Iran during the blockade crisis will remember that Iran's strategic judgment proved catastrophically flawed and that association with Iranian interests carries unacceptable risks. What happens next depends entirely on internal Iranian decision-making, because there are no external actors willing to mediate, no international mechanisms available to provide face-saving compromises, and no diplomatic options that would allow Iran to claim success while ending the blockade. Iran must choose between continuing a strategy that has failed completely while economic collapse accelerates, or acknowledging failure and accepting the domestic political consequences of that acknowledgement. Qatar's silence following 3 weeks of Iranian isolation makes clear that the international community has already decided the outcome. The blockade is over. Iran lost. The only remaining question is how long it takes Tehran to accept that reality and what domestic political crisis unfolds when they do. The final ally has gone silent. Iran stands alone. And the clock is still running.